a lot of people asked us to talk about was brought up a little bit by what you just said, and that was, how do you know this is a sermon? And so you have to be approaching Hebrews with an understanding of its nature, and hence have to deal somewhat with the concept of authorship. And of course, Hebrews, any section on authorship is going to be very long and pretty much very theoretical, because Hebrews doesn't present a specific author. And so one of the theories that I'm sure at some point in my studies down through the years, I heard somebody present this theory, and it stuck with me. But I simply, in reading the book and in considering the book, came to the conclusion from my own studies that this strikes me as a sermon delivered by the Apostle Paul, but written down and rendered in its current form not by the Apostle Paul. I'm certainly not the first person to recognize that anyone who is very familiar with Pauline syntax and style and vocabulary and terminology, that's not Hebrews.
Right.
If you want to make sure to completely frustrate a beginning Greek student, throw them into Hebrews, because it is some of the hardest language in the New Testament. And of course, everyone has always pointed out that it is very, very similar to Luke and Acts in its syntax and style and everything else. And so my theory is that either Paul preached this sermon, maybe more than once, and then asked Luke to make it available for non-Hebrew speaking Christians, maybe Jewish Christians, obviously, but in the diaspora, many of those Jewish believers lost the ability to actually read Hebrew. They became dependent upon the Greek Septuagint. And so either Paul would request Luke to do this, or maybe it was Luke that went to Paul and said, I know all sorts of folks who would really, really be blessed by this. Can I write this down and send it out, so on and so forth. We don't obviously know the details, but that it is Pauline in its essence, source. It's certainly its theology, but that it's Lucan in its expression in the Greek language. And there were people that in the early church that had Luke in there, and obviously if Luke's closely related to Paul, then that's how it's going to work and things like that. So my understanding is that you pretty much came to a similar conclusion?
Well, I assume that you've decided it's not Priscilla.
Right.
So we'll put that one over on the shelf. Yeah, I actually did. In fact, in 1991, I pulled up on my computer the paper that I wrote on this when I was at DTS, Dallas Theological Seminary. And we had to write a paper on the authorship of Hebrews. And I wrote down these words. I can look at it. It has the flavor of Paul, but the style of Luke. And therefore I came to the same conclusion that this is a sermon that Paul preached, and Luke, traveling with Paul, heard it. It's a mesmerizing, wonderful piece of rhetoric.
It is.
And biblically, theologically rich. If you want to understand how to handle the Old Testament and bring it into the modern day with the original point, with application and a Christological focus, I can't think of a better place to go than Hebrews. We're holding in our hands the most ancient sermon. I just find that astounding to me.
Yeah, at least in having enough of it to be able to really analyze it, that's most definitely the case. But it also strikes me, however, that you chose a book that for most evangelicals, is pretty much a closed book. I see the connection you're making, but let's just be honest, Hebrews is not the most preached book by any stretch of the imagination. I think most people skip it because it requires such an intimate knowledge of the least popular portions of the Old Testament.
Yeah.
I mean, how many evangelicals in most of our churches have any idea who Melchizedek was,
Right.
have ever spent nearly the amount of time that this author does in Leviticus, of all places, talking about sacrifices and where the certain pieces of furniture are in the tabernacle, not even the temple. The tabernacle is what it focuses upon. I mean, it is very in-depth, and I really think that especially once you have Origen come along in church history, you get the idea of the early churches embracing of an allegorical interpretation, and hence the diminishment of the literal meaning of the words and looking for only a spiritual meaning and things like that. Ever since that, up through the Reformation, Hebrews just languished in the background. And even since the Reformation, when I think of my seminary classes, sure, I took entire classes on Romans and stuff like that. And I know there are classes. I'm not saying there aren't classes on Hebrews, but it just is not the type of book that gets preached very often, which is why I preached through it in the 2000s somewhere. I think I did 85 sermons or something like that through Hebrews, and that kicked it up to one of my very, very favorite books. But it is tough. Some of the uses of the Old Testament by the writer are very challenging, very, very challenging. And I just think a lot of pastors steer clear of it because of the landmines that they think may well be there, and the fact that they know that the amount of background information that you have to communicate to make it really understandable is really challenging, especially if you're in a context where the sermon is pretty much limited to about 35 minutes at most, and sometimes even less. Would you agree?
I wholeheartedly agree. Whenever I preached or taught through it, I almost always hear folks say they've never heard anything preached, maybe than preaching Hebrews 4:12 regarding certain passage portions of it, or Hebrews 10, and talking about not forsaking the assembly, but understanding the book as a whole. Most Christians just have no idea whatsoever. But I think Hebrews is one of the richest books and the most Christ exalting books in the New Testament, in showing his superiority over everything. And there's several people that got me hooked on Hebrews a while back, and you were one. A long time ago, I wrote you before we were even really friends, and you sent me a couple of things you did on the Better Covenant.
Right.
I've still got that on my computer. Interestingly enough, David Allen. Now, there's two names together you don't hear very often, right? James White and David Allen. But David Allen loves the book of Hebrews. And I remember Warren Wiersbe talking about, and this was how I first got started. He said there's 3 books in the New Testament. He said, in the Old Testament, the just shall live by faith. He said, if you want to understand the just, you need to know the book of Romans. If you want to understand how the just shall live, you got to understand the book of Galatians. If you want to understand how the just shall live by faith, you got to understand the book of Hebrews. And it struck me, and those became the 3 books that I put a lot of time and energy into.
Yeah, I remember I was traveling somewhere. I don't remember where it was. Maybe it was a question that I was asked. I don't honestly remember. But I had a fairly long flight, and this had to have been a long time ago because I remember the little New Testament that I had with me. I think it was a little NIV I know I could not possibly read it today. The font was so small. So this had to have been in my early 40s before the eyesight went south. But I remember going, you know what? I'm just gonna set everything else aside. I'm just gonna read this book, and I'm gonna ask the question, what is this communicating? What is the purpose of this book? And so I put everything else aside, and on that flight, most people think these books take forever to read. They don't. It's just a matter of minutes, literally. You can get through the entirety of even the longest books. And I get done with it, and it is so clear that what the author is doing is saying there's nothing to go back to. Clearly, you have Jewish Christians who are being pressured to go back to the old ways, and this is an apologetic. It is an argument saying there's nothing to go back to. Christ is the superior fulfillment of all of these things, and that's what every single chapter is about. And it's a warning. Of course, there's all sorts of the warning passages, but it's clearly meant to be communicated to the community of faith, to the gathered body, and there's nothing to go back to. And so once I got that idea down, then I really started asking, well, why isn't this book, which to me, you have the longest, fullest discussions of the intention and purpose of the Father, the Son, the Spirit in the death of Christ in the entire New Testament. I mean, Romans 8, you get a couple passages in Romans, a couple verses in Galatians, scattered references elsewhere, but let's be honest, Hebrews 7, 8, 9, into 10, entire chapters unpacking this idea of the once-for-all sacrifice of Christ. And I've said, I think the fact that most evangelicals have a primarily sentimental view of the cross rather than a theological view of the cross is because Hebrews is not preached and known the way that it should be. I've said most people's theology of the cross is more determined by their hymnology than by inspired revelation in Scripture.
Wow.
And I stand by that. At least that's been my experience in the past. And certainly I've tried to do what I can in the churches that I'm involved with to make sure that's not the case for our people. But I really think that that's the case for a lot of people, is that they have a very emotionally oriented understanding of the cross. And that's why it's one of the reasons we have the attack on PSA, penal substitutionary atonement. There are entire books being published now saying that penal substitutionary atonement is this terrible, horrible, backwards tradition. It's unbiblical, et cetera, et cetera. And I think a lot of that also goes back to the fact that Hebrews and that entire sacrificial system in the background and what it meant and the shedding of blood. And I remember the first time I saw a video of a lamb having its throat slit, literally. And then the people making it were saying, this was happening almost continuously in the temple. These sounds, these sights, and we just have such a wildly cleaned up version of all of that, that the idea of wrath and sacrifice has just been completely turned into, that's something over there. I don't want anything to do with that. And so when you go to Hebrews and you take the time to look at the Old Testament and learn the background, and that takes time, it takes effort. I think it's one of the best things that you can do for the people of God is to direct them that way. And I'm just very thankful that despite some of the early canonical setbacks, in the sense that there were people in the early church that had questions concerning the book of Hebrews because of the issue of authorship, wanted to make sure that it was apostolic. I'm glad there were people in the early church that had those standards. But despite all that, this book has been preserved for us. And it's interesting, I'm not sure if you noted this, but as I look at it, I've never done a in-depth study, but I think I'm correct that the manuscripts we have of Hebrews are probably the cleanest. They have the least variance whatsoever.
Well, maybe it would, if you don't mind, it might be helpful for your audience if we could go over just a little bit of why we would say, what is our argumentation for this being a sermon? Would that be okay?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Yeah, so I had several things, so, and feel free to stop me anytime you want to discuss them or add to them. But first, the writer of Hebrews characterizes his own writing as, quote, in chapter 13, verse 22, a word of exhortation.
Right.
And the only other use of that phrase in the New Testament is in Acts 13:15, where Paul's invited to give a word of exhortation in the synagogue, and then he stands up and delivers a biblical sermon in verses 16 to 41 in chapter 13. So that's just one. Now, any of these alone, I don't think is enough, but I think that's interesting. Second, if you look at the language that's adopted, it identifies really a speaker with his audience. So you have the use of the first person plural, we, us, our, addressing the congregation as brothers. Both of those are techniques, that are identifying with his hearers, while at the same time asserting authority. The third thing I would say is that throughout the book, the writer chooses language of speaking and hearing, like in chapter 2 and verse 5, of which we are speaking. Verse 11 of chapter 5 of you become dull of hearing. Chapter 6 and verse 9, though we speak in this way. Chapter 11 verse 32, and what more shall I say? All of this is the language of a sermon, it sounds like.
Right.
Then there's the alternation between exposition of Scripture and exhortation all throughout the book.
Right.
Is striking. And then I'd say then there are rhetorical devices throughout the book. You have alliteration. So you have the writer chooses 5 Greek words that all have share the P sound in the opening verse.
Yep.
You have repetition. The word better, which you have pointed out in some of your writing as well, appears over and over again in chapter 1, chapter 6, chapter 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, all those chapters. You have inclusios. Throughout that, we could go through that if we wanted to, but there's rhetorical questions that are in there in chapter 1 and verse 14. It's a rhetorical question. As you read it, it sounds like that whatever this is, it was written for the ear, as much as anything else. Then finally, I would say the illustrative imagery throughout the book. You have, it's like a memorable sermon, a ship missing a harbor in chapter 2 and verse 1. A double-edged sword piercing one's innermost being in chapter 4 and verse 12. Fields that produce either crops or weeds in chapter 6. And then an anchor holding to the bottom of the sea. So all of those things put together helps me think this really is sermonic in nature.
Yeah, and it starts off, maybe that's why you don't have the standard introduction that you would have in any type of epistle that you'd be writing at that time period. But it starts off, God, after he spoke long ago to the fathers and the prophets in many portions and in many ways, not nearly as many P's in the English, but you're correct there that it is in the Greek. In these last days has spoken to us in his Son. So it's immediately not only associating the writer / speaker with the audience, but yeah, this is what you'd expect from a sermon, from a person that comes before the people. There's been worship. Now there's going to be worship in the presentation of God's truth, and we're right into it immediately. The assumption is that these people would know who the fathers and the prophets were and how they had been spoken in many portions in many ways. There's certainly nothing here that would tell us that this is a book that is meant to just be out by itself without a context. Because how could you cannot understand the book of Hebrews without having the Greek Septuagint. Now, I don't want to get too deeply into the weeds. And I think this was outside the chapters that you dealt with. But one of the issues that if we're going to handle Hebrews properly, we're going to have to struggle with, and it is a struggle. It's a tough thing. Is the fact that the writer is, or the preacher is preaching to people who are using the Greek translation of the Old Testament.
Right.
And he's using that Greek translation. And twice, and maybe it's more, but just off the top of my head, twice he utilizes the Greek Septuagint translation where it differs from the underlying Hebrew, and actually does so to his benefit. In other words, it fits what he's saying. So, for example, the section in Hebrews 10 about a body you have prepared is different from the Masoretic text, which talks about drilling through the ear. And in the quotation, interestingly enough, from Jeremiah 31 about the new covenant in Hebrews chapter 8, the Masoretic text has Baal, though I was a husband to them. And the Septuagint translates Gaal, though I did not care for them. Now, it's only one letter difference in the Hebrew, but it makes a huge difference as far as meaning goes. And yet the application made by the author to Hebrews fits with the Greek Septuagint rendering in both of those places. Now, that raises all sorts of questions, which I'm now going to give you 2 hours to answer. No, I'm gonna sit back and learn. No, it raises all sorts of really challenging questions in regards to the locus of inspiration, the methodologies of inspiration, all sorts of things like that. But one thing it does do that we can, I think, expand upon here is a preacher who is utilizing the text that his hearers would have access to, not to something they don't have access to. So, what does that mean to us as we are looking at our congregations? And especially today, see, in that day, they did not have multiple translations. There may have been a few people in the congregation that could read both Greek and Hebrew. That would be extremely rare, especially once you get outside of Israel. You might have, a rabbi that would travel or something like that who might be able to read both. But the fact is, for most churches that Paul's writing to, for example, all they have is for scriptures is the Greek Septuagint. And so today, when we open up our doors, we have people walking in with these little digital devices, and I don't know. You are old enough to remember this. Remember I had an 8 translation New Testament.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I do remember those.
It was a beast. I mean, it was huge. Because you literally had 8 different translations on the page, of 4 on one side, 4 on the other. The Living Bible was always the shortest, and and always the weirdest of all of them. That was for sure. But you had 8 of them right there, and that was really weird. That had not really ever happened in the history of the church at all. So we faced something new, and so I don't know how we can follow the example of the writer of the Hebrews, who uses what people are going to have in their laps without having to do mental gymnastics in figuring out what the guy's talking about. How do we do that now? I mean, the writer of the Hebrews, he used the Greek Septuagint. That's very clear that that was what he was focused on. I'm not sure how you even make application now, given the wide variety of translations that are available. This, of course, is a King James only argument. Well, just use the King James. I don't think that's King James only argument. I think it is worthwhile, I think, to have the elders in a church have a discussion about, if we have a pew Bible, are we going to stick with it? Or do I just simply have the freedom to just go with whatever translation I feel is best for this week? Or do we even try to say to our people, let's utilize a particular translation. Let's utilize the ESB or the New Legacy Study Bible or whatever else it might be. I'm sure there could be some people doing that. Do we do that? Is there an advantage to having that kind of consistency in light of the fact that some of the arguments in Hebrews do turn on a particular phrase? They turn on a word, which may not be in somebody else's translation. What do you think about that?
Well, you're raising an interesting point, because this will probably get me in trouble with some of my elders, because most of them use ESV, and I've started preaching out the New American Standard again because I just prefer it. So they'll probably, if they're watching, they'll probably want to have this discussion to make a decision. But I think there is something to that in regards to, I'll have people in my congregation that if they're not using the same translation, they do feel at times, find it hard to follow me, especially if I'm focusing on a particular word that's in my translation and not theirs.
Yep.
I would want to make one point, and that is, I think we would both agree that Paul, if he is preaching this, which I believe he is not grabbing the Septuagint because the way it words it fits his argument.
Right.
And that is happening today. So I heard a preacher the other day. He used 3 different translations in his sermon, all of them to prop up whatever he was trying to say, including in 1 Corinthians 6, when he didn't want to talk harshly about homosexuality. He used the NLT, which says male prostitutes. And so he was doing that in order to stay away from things he didn't want to say, if you will, and to make his LGBTQ audience, because that's the words he was using, feel more comfortable. So I think we do have to avoid the danger of doing that. And one of the things I think that does help us avoid that danger is by sticking to a particular translation that is faithful to the text, that is faithful to a good, solid translation of the original, and not being tempted to deviate to a different translation that we feel will better serve the point we want to make, which, by the way, is the exact opposite of what exposition is. We don't want exposition to be, here's what I would like to say, let me find the best translation to push my point.